going to show you how to make music in the style similar to GMJ and Matter. So both GMJ and Matter are independent artists that release amazing music on labels such as Sudbeat, Anjunadeep, Replug, but they also come together to collaborate and write a lot of awesome music and started their own label called Meanwhile. GMJ and Matter's specific style is very groovy, emotive, atmospheric. Basically, it's great for a dance floor, but it's also full of melody. I'm going to show you how I made this track and how I built some of the atmospheres and the melodic elements so that you can learn how to make this style for yourself. I'll start with the main groove first, and then I'll work into the breakdown, which is what you hear in a lot of GMJ and Matter's tracks. GMJ and Matter was highly requested by my patrons as well as a lot of YouTube comments. So big shout out to everybody for letting me know that you'd like me to cover this style. And thanks to GMJ and Matter for actually giving me the green light to go ahead and cover their style.
Hey everyone, GMJ here. Dowden, big thanks for having us on, brother. Looking forward to more of those beautiful tunes of yours coming out with us at Meanwhile soon as well. To all the subscribers, keep rocking and leveling up those tunes.
Hey everyone, Matter here. Just want to say hey to Dowden first. Hey mate, pleasure to release your music on Meanwhile Recordings. I'm looking forward to releasing some more music with you soon. And a big hello to all of your YouTube subscribers. Hey everyone, keep making tunes. Big love.
They are fantastic artists and fantastic people, and now I'm lucky enough to call them my friends. And a little disclaimer, this video is for education purposes only. I highly recommend you take what you're learning from this video or any of these how to make music like videos and apply them to your own music to carve your own path in music. Don't just take this project file, download it, and release it as your own music, and take it to create your own identity within music. Before we get started, make sure to hit the subscribe button so you get more videos like this one, and if you want to download this project file, click the link in the description below. Let's go ahead and get started with the track. First and foremost, there's some important elements that we have to consider when writing this style of deep progressive house. Number one, you want to have a very catchy, swingy shaker loop. The shaker loops are typically very swingy, they have a lot of flow, they have a lot of groove, and they're sometimes pretty airy, meaning they're a lot of high end and they're not so rigid sounding and sharp, but a little bit softer sounding and a little bit more maybe reverberated. A really strong bass line groove. So usually you're gonna have a solid bass line hitting that's really catchy, really swingy and groovy, but then you're gonna have some complementary hits and some things that are kind of changing the bass line so it stays really interesting and sounds very intricate, but always maintaining that strong groove. Huge atmosphere. So a really big part of these tracks is that they have a ton of melodic content, usually in the form of these really nice sounding strings, pads, and atmospheric sounds. And we'll talk all about that in the video. Lead sounds are not in every one of these tracks because there's a lot of atmospheric elements that kind of carry the melodic aspect of the track, but sometimes these hypnotic leads really give the track its identity and make it really unique. And last but not least, you gotta have an Australian accent like Matter and GMJ. Good day, mate. So the way that I'm going to do this is go into each individual layer and actually show what I did and kind of how I got there and why I chose to do that. So starting with the kick drum, I have here the kick with just a drum bus and an EQ. It's a kick that I made myself, just layering up and compressing the kick itself. It sounds pretty good on its own. The drum bus is used to bulk it up a little bit. Only 20% dry wet. And then the EQ is taking off that high end. It's just a little bit too snappy. So I'm using that top low pass filter to cut out that high end. And just be careful because you don't want to take out too much, or otherwise it sounds too muffled. Like really, really easily. And too much is too bright. And that's it for the kick. For the bass line, what I typically do is I start with a pluck sound. I don't start with like a typical, just a sub bass of a clean sine wave. I start with a low pluck. And this is because I can hear it a lot better than I can a sine wave, which is just a clean bass signal. So if I have this low pluck, instantly gonna start to try to write my bass line. So I can play my kick, and I can start to either use a keyboard, or I can hum or tap or just draw in the MIDI myself and start to create this bass line. For this style of deep progressive music, with GMJ and Matter's style, the bass lines are super groovy, really nice and deep, but they have these little intricacies to the groove that makes them feel so exciting and interesting. So first we'll start with just a simple groove, really catchy, and then I'll add in those intricacies to make it more interesting. So first, low pluck. I have an octave playing up there, just the same note, the B. And it's simple, but it's catchy, it's groovy. That's all I need to worry about for that first bass line layer, just being nice and catchy and groovy. If it doesn't sound groovy, just try something else. Just move some notes around until you find that it's really making you want to dance and kind of bob your head. Otherwise, don't move on from this because it's just going to get more and more away from the groove. So then I have the low pluck. Let's look at the actual sound itself. It's just a sawtooth wave on oscillator 1, down 12 semitones. Oscillator 2 is about half the volume, and I'm using a square wave up here. And the reason I'm using it is because it kind of sounds a little bit more like resonant almost. Like if I go to the saw, right, it kind of punches through the top a little bit more. I get more of like a boom kind of tonal sound. And then I'm pushing that resonance up to get even more of that tonal sound. It kind of punches through just a little bit harder. The frequency is at about 50 hertz, and then I have a 24 decibels per octave. Filter 1 on envelope 2, so 68% of the sustain. That is just to hold open the filter a little bit as I'm holding the note. And what's interesting about this is I've actually put on a little bit of unison, which is typically not a good idea for basses, but then I'm adding some mid-side EQ to pull out that low-end stereo image. So that without it, it kind of sounds a little bit more digital. It just doesn't sound as interesting. So I put that unison up with the voices up to 3, and then the amount up to about 23%. And then I've cut out that low end of both the mids and the sides, but the low end of the mids is only cut out with some automation. It will come back in over here. The sub was very heavy, so I also toned it down a little bit. Then I'm using a multiband dynamics to bring down the low end a little bit more and to control it with some compression. I found it was a little bit too low present, so that's why I'm removing some of that low. Then I have a compressor, which is just a slowish attack, 37 milliseconds, to allow that bass to punch through even more. So the beginning of the transient, or the beginning of the sound, is going to punch through a little bit, and then it's going to compress after that, which will then make it feel a little bit punchier. And then finally, I have another mid-side EQ, just really making sure I'm getting rid of all those low sounds there. So now that I have this low pluck, sounding pretty groovy and catchy, I want to actually push the envelope of this. I did not mean to make a pun there, but that's literally what I'm doing. And just make this more interesting. Having your bass have faster repetitive notes typically makes the songs feel a little bit faster. So if you have tracks that have more broken up bass notes or empty spaces in between, it will actually sometimes make the track feel slower than it actually is. So keep that in mind when you're writing your bass lines as well. So what I can do is actually go into the envelope section of this. So you can change the envelopes and choose what information you want to actually change inside of the MIDI clip. So I can open this up and I can say, okay, I want to control the pluck. So the pluck itself is the instrument, so it's the wavetable. Inside of wavetable, I want to change the filter 1 frequency. So I go to filter 1 frequency. Of course, you can do this to all the settings inside of wavetable. I want to change the frequency, and I've drawn in this bit of envelope shaping here, and take a listen to how this sounds now. Sounds way more interesting and professional, and I've only done a little bit of changes on the cutoff filter. So the filter itself is opening and closing more and more based on the settings that I drew in here. So let's take a look at the actual filter now. You can see the blue is changing a little bit. So that's the actual amount. And you can see this filter opening and closing a little bit more. Because of this, it sounds much more professional and interesting and unique. And the way that I kind of angled it up gives it that like swooping. So it's like, whoa. And these lower notes, I've brought down the cutoff. And this is because I want the low end to come through, but I don't want the high end to come through. And this is because with the kick, it sounds really groovy. But if I take out these MIDI notes, it feels like it's a little bit empty. Right here. Right? It's a bit of a gap. But if I put this here with the envelope up, it just felt like it was a little bit too obvious or a little bit too kind of static sounding. Right? So I met myself in the middle, I pulled down the frequency, and then I'm filling up that gap with a little bit of low end, the same amount of low end typically, and it kind of just makes it feel like it's not so chuggy and choppy. And this is really important because if you put the bass lines too far apart, or if you have too many empty spaces in between, the kind of groove feels a little bit more techy and a little bit more like broken up. And if you have it more of a rolling bass line like this, where there's not as many kind of spaces in between, then it will sound more hypnotic, more vibey, more deep progressive like GMJ and Matter, and myself actually, because we tend to write really similar styles. And by doing this, I'm eliminating that top end of the bass, but I still retain that low end, and I kind of fill up those empty spaces. This is what a lot of producers will do to kind of make the bass lines feel super intricate without just being too full of the mid frequencies. Almost forgot to mention that the bass actually does change notes in the breakdown, which I'll cover a little bit later, but it does change from the B notes up to D and then up to E. And this is just changing the notes will work really well with the rest of melodic elements of the track. So I'll let you hear that when I showcase the breakdown. This bass line sounds good already, but let's actually add another accent to this so that it sounds even more interesting. So I will add this accent low, and the synth itself is just the same synth. I've just changed the square wave is in between the sawtooth and the square, and that the lower octave is actually quieter. And then I've changed the resonance so that's lower, and the matrix I have changed from the envelope 2. I've just increased that a little bit so it's more of a pluck sound, and it sounds like this. So if I solo this, I'm cutting out a lot of the low end, boosting up lower mids, and then some reverb. This is, again, just catchy. If I listen to it on my own with the kick, just the kick and the accent, it has to be catchy. Right, if I don't make that catchy, it's probably going to pull away the quality of the groove. So I'm just adding a simple accent, but it's going to reset the listener's ears every time that it hears it. So instead of just being the same thing over and over, it's just going to be this little accented part that is going to kind of reset the listener so that they feel like it's more interesting and they're engaged for a longer time. Especially with these long tracks that are supposed to be more hypnotic, this is something that you can do to make the listener feel like they're more engaged. Awesome. Moving on to the light plucks here. This is something that I heard in a lot of GMJ and Matter's tracks. They will have these little accents that are very quiet in the background, but they are still catchy and still groovy, and they're there to complement the groove and the swing even more. So look at the sound itself. I'll take off all the effects here. It's just a simple pluck. I'm using amber wavetable. It's a little bit hard to hear, so I'll try and turn that up. Using 2 filters, so I'm cutting out the low end and the high end. A little bit of unison. And then I'm cutting out a lot of low end and a lot of the high again. And then adding a vocoder to add a little bit of kind of like saturation and grit. It's very hard to hear. Put that back down to where it was at -10. And then I have this delay. Super quiet, but when I put that in with the bass line and the kick, or I'll just try it with the bass line first, it's catchy, right? If that was the bass line on its own, it would still sound pretty good. Let's try it. Turn that filter off, turn this filter off. Right, so that, I mean, it's pretty empty sounding, but it's sounding pretty nice. And the idea is that it's going to be kind of filling up a little bit of that low mid section. Again, I don't want the bass line to feel chuggy usually. So having these light plucks in the background kind of fills up a little bit more of that warm low end. Right? It's ear candy. It's just something that you can just kind of, you don't really notice, but it's there and is subconsciously interesting, and it increases the quality of your tracks by quite a bit. Lastly, I have this wide bass. This wide bass is really quiet again, but it's there to kind of fill up a little bit of that low mid area. You might think that it's accumulating a lot of mud, but this is why we actually are EQing out a lot of that low area, because it will get muddy if you have too many elements down here. But filling up this low mid section is kind of the way to get that really low warm feeling out of these tracks. Let's listen to the sound without the EQ, reverb, and chorus, and it does not sound great. Just a sawtooth wave with some frequency cutting off And then the LFO is actually working on the filter as well as the oscillator 2 positions. This is slightly moving up and down, very slightly, and the cutoff, just to give it a sense of movement. And then I have some unison on there as well. Once I EQ and add some chorus and reverb, it sounds much better. It's just like this warm, low pad that's just filling up a little bit of that empty space in between. I don't want any stereo imaging on anything around below 200. And then I have some auto panning as well and some sidechain from the kick. Very quiet. Let's take a listen to the kick and bass line all together. So now you can hear that the bass line feels more complex, more intricate, when there's really not that many things going on. You can add more layers to this if you want, more accents to this, but I like the way that it is right now, so we're gonna move on to the drums next. So I'm going to focus on the drums. The most important part of the drum loop, I would actually argue, is the shakers section of the track. A lot of these deep progressive style tracks have really swingy, catchy shakers. They have typically a lot of airiness to them, and they just make the whole track feel lighter and more hypnotic and more vibe oriented. If your shakers and your drums are more static and a little bit stale and don't really feel like they're like kind of grooving and rolling along, then the track might not feel as atmospheric and as kind of hypnotic as you'd like. This was one of the harder things that I had to learn when I was learning to make this music, is to focus a lot of attention on your shakers, either by choosing a really good shaker loop or by creating one yourself. So I have a shaker loop with tons of layers already in here that I made, but I've also layered that up with a shaker loop from Bound to Divide's new sample pack. So first I'll show you my shaker loop. You might recognize it from another video that I actually created this shaker loop from, which you can watch right here. But I've turned everything off, just kept this one hi-hat, and I'm actually using an LFO on the vocoder release time. So that's why you get that kind of movement. You can see here. So that vocoder is adding a bit of white noise to the shaker and making it feel like it's moving and making it feel less static. And then I have some reverb, some compression. I don't think this LFO is doing anything to the sound specifically. And then I have some reverb that is actually not on. It's used for the buildup, which I'll talk about later. And then the sidechain is from the kick drum. Just gives it that nice groove following the kick. So it's a pretty bulky shaker. It's a pretty weighted shaker, meaning that it has a lot of sound kind of coming through, but I like that it just felt like it was energetic and it carried the track really well. For the second shaker, I actually have taken a sample loop from Bound to Divide's new sample pack called Atmospheres. I'll put a link to the sample pack in the description below because I actually use it a few times in this video and I will show you when I use it. So the shaker loop here is a top loop. But just hear how dynamic that is. It has so much movement and so much going on that I'm adding that as part of the shaker loop. And together, they just sound really great. So much movement, so much ear candy. A really good tip to consider is that when you're working with groove and swing, the groove is kind of like being on the grid and being catchy on the grid. And swing is kind of like pushing off the grid, but still maintaining that groove. So it's kind of like you can keep the groove to solidify the momentum of the track and the groove of the track, but the swing is going to kind of alleviate a little bit of that tension of the groove by staying close to the grid, but being a little bit off. And that's going to give you that loose feeling, so it's not so rigid, and that makes it feel more hypnotic and makes you feel a little bit more, I guess, vibe oriented and a little bit more swingy and airy. So a really good tip is when you're focusing on groove, think about the adhering to the grid. You're kind of focusing more on being on the grid and making a strong momentum with that groove. But swing is a little bit more loose. You're kind of deviating a little bit off the grid and you're just adding a little bit of a realistic feel to the sound. Shakers are really good for this. So putting them a little bit more swingy, maybe using a groove pool or adding a little bit of width and moving the MIDI notes around a little bit so that they feel a little bit more organic and realistic realistic is what's going to make your shaker loops feel very professional and work well with this style. If you're not great at making your own shakers, like I said, then just grab shaker loops from sample packs like this Basic Waves Atmospheres. Next, I have the hi-hat, very basic hi-hat, just on the upbeat. I have 2 layers, and they're just slightly apart from each other. Again, just adding a little bit of swing by not being totally on the 16th grid here. And what else I have is this secondary kind of hatchy, swingy hi-hat. So that second hat is very common in this style so that it doesn't feel so techy and chuggy. It's not so rigid sounding when you have this. It's a little bit more swingy. Just some saturation to bulk up the hat. Cutting out that low end I don't need. Moving on to the clap, very simple, just cutting out the clap a little bit with the fade out so that it doesn't feel so long of a sample. If I pull that off, you'll hear it just has a little bit too much tail. So I've cut that out, much tighter sounding. EQ, cutting out that low end I don't need, and then saturation and compression. Compressor's not even doing anything, so I'll just get rid of that. Very simple. All of these are being sent to a return channel of reverb. So if I look here, just this reverb with pretty quick decay time, under a second. Everything's being sent there individually. Then I have a bongo. This is, again, keeping in mind the groove, the pattern, the catchiness. Right, so with my kick, simple grooves, simple catchy rhythms, just to add a little bit more spice to the drum loop. Then I have a clave, very, very popular among deep progressive and progressive house. And yes, it is pronounced clave. I've Googled it many times. I swear, if I'm wrong on it, not this time, it's gonna be hilarious. Don't Google it. Don't prove me wrong. Again, with the clave, you want it to be kind of catchy. It's almost like it's a hook, right? Like when you hear it, it's catchy to the song. But I've made it very quiet. Well, somewhat quiet. It's just there to complement the drums and the drum loop itself. Forgot to mention the effect snare. So this is a snare with a lot of delay and reverb on there. I'm using the Haas effect, which is a stereo delay, meaning that it's playing from the left to the right over about 19 milliseconds, and it just makes it sound very wide. So now that you know each individual layer of the drums, try to focus on each layer as I'm playing it and see if you can really hear what each layer is kind of adding to the drum loop. I'll even turn some of them off. They each have their place, and I don't want to overdo it. There is quite a few elements going on here, but I find that it's just overall adding a lot of a groove and swing to the track, making it feel nice and full and interesting. By the way, everybody, I do offer music production coaching as well as music production courses online. So if you're looking to increase your production game with courses, working at your own pace, check the link in the description below for links to my Dowden Production Academy online courses. And if you want to do online coaching with me, one-on-one video calls so you can ask questions, get track feedback, and become a better producer, then also check out the description for links to coaching with me. All right, back to the video. Moving on to the synths now. With deep progressive house, you typically want a lot of atmosphere and space in these types of tracks. Usually they're not too aggressive of sounds, and they kind of all blend together to create like this musical like smoothie, I guess. They all blend really well together, and it just creates this beautiful overall track. First, I'm going to show a drone, which is very common in this style of music. It starts from typically the very beginning of the track and plays the whole way through. It's a constant pitch that goes through the whole track, and it just kind of glues all of the melodic elements together. So for the drone, it just sounds like this. And to make that, I actually resampled a vocal. So I also have this vocal pad, but I'm going to use this to create this drone pad that I have here. So what I'm going to do is insert an audio track, resample, and then I'm going to just solo the vocal pad and record the audio here. On the vocal pad, I'm going to put a ton of reverb. So I'll put 100% dry wet. I'll turn off that utility for now. I want to hit the freeze button. So if I hit record, and then inside the vocal pad, I'm going to hit freeze. Now that I have that playing, I can hit freeze again to turn that off. And I've recorded what that frozen reverb sounds like. And that sounds really good. So that is going to be my drone for the track. So I had a different vocal sample for this one. So I'm actually going to use that one instead because I'm going to use this vocal pad for something else. So I'll get rid of this one. On the drone, I just have EQ, reverb, and this free plugin called Wider, which I'll go over in a sec. So without the EQ, it's not that great sounding. Pushing up some of the airiness, cutting out some of the muddiness. And then the reverb is where it makes it feel nice atmospheric. Then the Wider plugin is actually a free plugin, so I'll put a link to that in the description below, and it is stereo spreading that even more. It's making it sound even wider. Really, really great tool. Vocal pad is a vocal sample that I chose, so I'm going to actually turn off everything here. I'm going to group this all together and turn that off. This is what the vocal pad sounds like. Doesn't really sound good necessarily, but when I listen with the kick, it's kind of catchy. Not really on time per se, but with this processing on, it sounds really cool in the track. Especially if I add a little bit of sidechain compression on the end, it will squish down when the kick hits, and it'll be kind of like complementary to the groove as well. And the reason I'm adding this is because it's like a pad, but it's dynamic. It moves around. It adds a little bit of rhythm to the drone. So the drone itself is very stale, but this vocal pad is moving. It's very hard to hear, but layering up these atmospheres like this is really what makes the tracks feel so lush. So it's a bit quiet, so I'm going to turn it up a little bit more. And that sounds really cool. So try this yourself. Grab like a vocal or a percussion or something that is kind of catchy. Like it can be kind of like a hook, and then you can put a huge reverb on that and make it really wide. So I have the EQ cutting off the lows and the highs. The delay is adding quite a bit of delay. Then I have this widening with the has effect, the reverb at 100% dry wet, and then the side chain to kind of push it out of the way to adhere to the kick groove. Great way of making it sound super professional to have these little layers that are just doing these little ear candies that you barely even hear, but they add to the overall track, the overall smoothie of the track. Then I have some atmosphere. So these are what make the track really shine at the end of the day, because the tracks are like 8 minutes long, 8.5, even 9 minutes long sometimes, and they get a bit repetitive. So you have these one-shot atmospheres that come in that really make the track feel beautiful. And this is where you can really express yourself even further. So this first atmosphere I have, it's just with this free plugin called Supermassive. So it is a reverb delay. I think it's called an algorithmic reverb. I could be wrong, but it basically just makes it sound really big and huge. So without, this is what this Pigments preset sounds like. And if you don't have Pigments, don't worry, I will be freezing and flattening any of the synths that are third party. So if you download the project, you will still have these samples. So it's inside modular preset. Doesn't sound that great on its own, but then when I solo turn on the Supermassive, huge atmosphere. So what I'll usually do is actually play the track, and then I will record on my keyboard with a ton of reverb and delay on these sounds and just play what I'm feeling, what these kind of emotional chords or notes will be. So if we listen to that, let's take a listen. I'll turn off all the other synths here, and we'll just listen to what those chords sound like in the track. Sounds really nice, right? So all I did was played my keyboard and recorded. And if it didn't sound good, I would just do it over and over again. And then what you can actually do is repeat this process over and over and resample. So record the audio of what this is doing. So if I wanted to do that, just like the vocal drone or the vocal pad, I can resample or choose specifically whatever synth I want. So I'll choose Atmo 1, I'll record, and I'll change this preset. So let's change this to something completely, it doesn't even matter what it is. With Supermassive, with these huge reverbs and delays, you can add a bunch of random stuff. Let's try a lead. Let's see how this sounds on its own. Okay, that one's a little bit detuned, so maybe we'll try one different one. Okay, we'll try this one. Supermassive, and let's hit record. Like, it still sounds good, right? And then you just let that play out, and now you have this audio, and you can place that anywhere you want in the track as part of it. Repeat this process, get a ton of different audio samples. So now we have this atmosphere. We'll just leave that in because it sounds really nice. I have some other atmospheres here. Same way I made them before. And then I just duplicate them. Place them throughout the track. And this one is important here. So I'm actually transitioning into the breakdown with this one. It's a really good tip to use these atmospheres to transition because it kind of takes the load off of the transition point. It makes it feel like you're kind of going into that transition a little bit smoother. I have a couple more here. All just a little bit different. And then I have a couple more down here. So this is another one of the Bound to Divide samples. So I'm going to put in another audio track here, and I'm going to grab one of the samples from the Bound to Divide sample pack. So I already have it down here. It is this one here, and it sounds like this. It's actually called a top loop inside of the pack. So if I look at the browser here, there's a ton of different really cool sounds. Great for adding like swing and dynamics to your drum loops. Remember I said get shaker loops? These are things that you can add to your shaker loops to make them sound very unique and very swingy. Ooh. So I've grabbed this one and I'm actually going to put a huge reverb and delay on it. So I'm going to bring this back down to here. I have this Supermassive. Sounds super cool. And then I've actually down-tuned 6 semitones, and then on this one 3 semitones. I'm gonna EQ out that low end because it's quite a bit. And now when we get to the breakdown, you're gonna hear how good this sounds with all the atmospheres. That was so good. So sounds that don't traditionally sound melodic, you can add these big reverbs and it just adds a lot of this quality, this like gritty quality that you might not hear or think that you would hear in these tracks, but they just add this kind of rough edge to the sound and it makes it sound very big and just kind of unique is the point I'm trying to make. So don't cancel out any sounds, try them with these big reverbs and these big delay effects and see if you can get some really interesting sounding stuff like I did in this track. Finally, we're going to talk about the lead that I have, and I'm really happy with the way that this lead sounds. It's actually 3 different layers and it sounds like this all together. So there's 3 different aspects of this lead that are all very important. The first is the lead sound itself. So just a simple sawtooth kind of triangle wave, nothing super special. And then the filter is only set to 12. If I set it to 24, it still sounds good, but it's kind of taking out too much of the high frequency. It sounds better with the 12 actually. And what I wanted to get with this pluck was I didn't want it to sound like every other pluck sound. I didn't want it just to be very basic. So I added this 12 filter and I wanted it to feel a little bit like kind of organic and analog sounding and a bit softer hitting. So it's not supposed to be so much of a hard hitting pluck. And This kind of helps it feel a little bit less traditional, I guess. Like it just doesn't sound as static and as typical as a lot of progressive. And that's what you want to do to increase the quality of your tracks, is to kind of get these things that sound a little bit more professional. So Matter actually recommended these two VST plugins to me by Baby Audio. They're both free. I'll put links to that as well in the description. I think you should just check out the description. There's tons of stuff down there. The pitch drift is a little bit of a pitch shifter. So if we listen very closely, I'll put the amount up and it actually changes the pitch. Almost like Rufus the Soul type stuff. But putting it down to about 50, it just makes it feel a little bit kind of out of pitch. And it's nice. It's not so static sounding, so robotic sounding. And then the magic switch, this nice chorusy warmth effect, and it just adds a little bit of quality to the sound. So before and after with both of those. Very subtle, but it's just those little subtleties that can sometimes make your track feel more professional than it used to. Honestly, the sound itself is not very interesting. It's just the EQ cutting out the lows and the delay and the pitch and magic. Even without the unison. 45 on the filter. And then I'm actually pushing this up into a reverb send that's not on right now. Sorry, the reverb is on here. Right, it's not a great sound, but with the reverb, EQ, I'll even push this up a little bit, so it's offsetting the delay a little bit. Ping pong is on. And then the filter is on, so you're kind of cutting out a little bit of the low of the sound when it's delaying over and over. The mid section is a duplicate of this. I have the Baby Audio, pitch drift, and magic switch. And then I'm using an operator, and this is to give it a little bit of weight, but it's a different sound. So I wanted to add a little bit of white noise to it, so I added white noise on this third channel. And just adding this layer to here just makes the sound feel unique and different. It has two layers and they're both a little bit different. Maybe I pitch one a little bit to the left, one a little bit to the right. Don't mind that, that's just the reverb. So the white noise just kind of fills it up a little bit, gives it a little bit more grit. Almost not even noticeable, but it is there, adding a little bit of quality. And then I have this lead plucked high, and this one is special because it's actually playing well before the lead comes in. And I noticed that in a lot of GMJ and Matter's tracks and other artists similar to this style, there is sometimes this background atmosphere of an art, but it's so quiet. And just listen to this. So same thing, pitch drift, magic switch. I'm cutting out a ton of the low end, boosting the highs, and just a lot of feedback on the delay. Ping pong too. Right? It's a very, very top end sound, and that's complementing not only the lead, but it's also part of the atmosphere in the first half of the track. It's like this icy ARP sound that's in the back that you don't really hear too much, but it's there and it's just carrying even more of that atmospheric vibe throughout the track, and it sounds even more hypnotic. I just want to go over this preset pack a little bit more. Shout out to Bound to Divide for this awesome pack. Lots of these top loops. Really cool stuff. Background dirt is kind of like filler. Great for creating some atmospheres and kind of textures. And then there's a lot of tonal atmospheres. So these are the ones I'm going to be using for sure to create like these drones. Right, like these atmospheres, the same as I did with this Pigments, creating this atmosphere. You throw one of these into your track. And you can get these really nice atmospherics in your songs without using these presets. It's a quick and easy way to add these melodic elements without having to make them yourself. Like I said, you can click the link in the description below for access to that sample pack. Last but not least, I have some effects. So I have some white noise here that's just using it for the build up. I have the white noise generator, which is something I've covered in a bunch of other videos. I'm not going to cover it again here. Then I have this FX riser. So I'm adding reverb and delay onto this, washing it out completely. It just sounds like this. Very quiet in the background to give a little bit of power to the build up. And then I have here this reverse. What I've done for that is added this delay with 3 and a 5. So they're different. You get that kind of back and forth overlapping delay, lots of feedback. And then I'm cutting out a lot of the low end. And when you filter like this, the delayed signals are going to filter out more and more every time. So it kind of washes out the sound and it thins out as the delay is playing. Very common in this style. I know Alex Orion does this a lot as well, and I do this a lot in my tracks. And then I have here another impact, but it's kind of like a more percussive clap sound, just to give some spice to the transitions of the track. That's basically it for the production of the track, except for automation. So the automation, I'm just using some white noise volume on here. I have here this wavetable frequency, so the cutoff is opening as the pluck is playing, as it's building. And here I'm just slightly moving the cutoff up and down throughout the track. So it's always changing, always sounding a little bit different. Then I have some automation on the actual reverb. So as the track is building up, it's sending to the return channel that is a giant reverb. All right, so we'll listen to that in context. I've done the same thing to the shakers, this build reverb. As the shakers are playing throughout the breakdown, I'm increasing the dry wet of the shakers of the reverb. So we can take a listen to that. Perfect. Let's take a listen to the breakdown into the drop. You can hear and pay attention to the automation. The last thing I'm doing, I forgot to mention, was actually cutting out the low frequencies of the bass as it's building up. So it's cutting out the lows so that it's increasing tension of that. So for the arrangement, I've just done, very basic arrangement, but this will be available in the project file, the mixed and arranged version of this. But focusing just on this last bit here, before the breakdown, I've kept the drums in the breakdown itself because I find that a lot of GMJ and Matters tracks have just the shakers in the breakdown. It's a great way to keep that rhythm going and then building up into the actual drop itself, bringing everything back in. Let's take a listen to the breakdown into the final drop one last time as you're paying attention to everything I've mentioned, the atmospheres, how they work, how the automation works, and how the melodic elements work with the bass changing in the final drop. And just remember that you can download this entire project file mixed and mastered like this in the link in the description below. All right, let's take a listen. Bass is changing. Opening the cutoff, opening the reverb, white noise, riser, and big drop. And that's it.